Greetings everyone, Melderon here on another Defcamp Melderon TV video. So today I'd like to talk about something that I think is not really a comparison point for many people when we compare retail to Classic WoW. When we think about Classic WoW, we think about why we like it, if you do, of course, there's comparison points that are pretty much always brought up. You know, no LFG, class identity, talent systems, open world, the way the world works and the way the world's integrated into the game itself. But a lot of people don't talk about, I think we overlook, is raid difficulty. Now, I understand that for many of you out there, the raid difficulty in Classic WoW is, well, just easy, especially for MC. In BWL, we're seeing a little uptick in that, but, you know, I think difficulty is going to increase linearly with each successive raid tier. But watching the World First race, and this is Onslaught you're watching right now, and I want to commend all of the guys, Calamity, Progress, Apes, Onslaught, all these guilds that actually went in there and did the World First BWL. It was an amazing feat to see. Despite all the issues, there were a lot of bugs in Razor Gore and the Suppression Room, but these guys overcame anyway and just got in there and right back in there and did what they had to do. Especially Onslaught and Apes, who got really screwed. Their will and their capability was just amazing. And watching that in the World First race on Cargo's stream was just super, super cool. And I really got into it. But what's really important is watching these world-class guilds do what they do so well. Watching them kill these bosses the way they, you know, the strategies they use, the really world-class DPS and healing and tanking and maintaining threat with these DPSers. It was just really, really cool to see. And I think the biggest hype for guilds is knowing that when you walk into that raid, it's the same difficulty. It's the same raid. Broodlord Lashlayer they're fighting here is the same Broodlord Lashlayer you're going to fight, with the same mechanics, same health pool, same armor values. To me, that's a super important thing for the overall hype of an MMO and keeping it fresh and keeping it real. Knowing that you're going to go in, regardless of your raid commitment, regardless of how much time commitment you have, whether you have world buffs, whether you have the best consumables, it's the same raid. And I think that's something we overlook when we compare retail to Classic WoW, and why we, at least myself and maybe many others like me, love Classic, because raiding is raiding. There's no normal, there's no LFG, there's no LFR, there's no heroic, there's no mythic, there's just raiding. And I know back in the day, when people saw raiders complete these raids, there was like this almost godlike worship of these raids, you know, especially people who actually cleared Naxx, who cleared Cthulhu. And we still have that, even 15 years later, watching guilds like this, either doing a world first or doing speedruns. And I think you can still have competitive nature and still have this, you know, awe almost of echelon and competitive nature with one raid tier and one raid difficulty. It's the point of this video is that I'm fundamentally against the idea of having multiple raid difficulties per tier. I think that having one and understanding that you are walking into or zoning into the same zone across the board makes things so much better from a game fantasy perspective, right? The boss you're killing is the same boss. You know, you don't get any extra loot, you don't get any extra bragging rights, except for maybe if you're doing a speedrun, but there's an even playing field. And you can still breed competitive nature, and we'll get into that in a second. But knowing from what I've seen, and looking at my own guild and my own raid, knowing that we watched this and then zoned in ourselves that night, the level of appreciation of the raid and of the mechanics was so much higher. Knowing that we're braving into the same place, we're trying to kill the same bosses and get the same loot. Now, this is a very high production video, of course, so we're going to be using paint to kind of discuss this a little bit more. So, the way that Classic WoW is built is pretty simple when you think about it, right? We have two axes pretty much. We have an axis here, and we have an x-axis that goes this way. And on the x-axis, guys, we're going to have dungeon and raid size, okay? So this is the amount of players that actually can zone into a specific raid. We have 4 sizes in Classic WoW as far as raid size is concerned. We have 5-man, we have 10-man, 20-man, and 40-man raids, which is the largest raid size that WoW has ever seen. Now, on the y-axis, we have character level. We can call it character level and eye level. I think that's kind of the way you would actually compare raids here, right? In Classic WoW, it's pretty simple. You have a bunch of dungeons that kind of go up as you level, as group content, and this keeps going up, and new dungeon, new dungeon, new dungeon, and they're stacked pretty much on top of each other. However, when you get to level 60, there's kind of a collection, I'd say, of group content you can do, and that's in the form of, let's say, Strat, Skolo, those two dungeons that are kind of in the same place. We have LBRS, and we have Dire Maul. So we have those 4 dungeons that are pretty much in the same difficulty. And then you have one that's kind of a little bit above them, which is Upper Blackrock Spire, which is a 10-man raid. It's technically a pre-raid raid, okay? And that's kind of what you're looking at before level 60, or when you hit level 60. The first raid tier is Molten Core. And as we know, this is pretty simple in today's standards of how, mechanics are concerned, and health values, and overall ease of the raid itself. And then we have BWL, which comes out right above MC. We've seen that clear already, and there are some tricky differences. Threat is a big part of this raid, and I think that is kind of a step up. And then we have these 20-man raids that come out that are kind of in the middle in difficulty of Molten Core and BWL. So then we have ZG that comes out before the next raid tier that kind of sits in the middle as far as itemization. As far as itemization, it's kind of a catch-up, but there's also pieces that are BIS, so it's somewhere in the middle. And as far as difficulty, it's a little bit harder than MC, a little bit less difficult than BWL, and it requires only 20 people to run, so you can actually split your raid up and get more loot that way. So that's an interesting thing too. And then we see the addition of AQ40 and AQ20, which in my opinion sits at the same difficulty, or maybe a little bit higher than ZG. Also catch-up mechanic, but there's also pieces in here that a lot of people would want. And then finally, guys, we have the echelon of Classic WoW rating, which is Naxxramas. As you can see, there's kind of a linear, if you can draw a line here, there's like a linear progression of difficulty that goes up. Whether you like this or whether you don't like this, this is the way the Classic WoW is designed, and I think it works well for the first iteration of the game. Can we improve upon this going in the future? Part of this video is thinking about how MMOs can be built to kind of both lend some credence to people who have less time to play the game, but also take care of those who play harder and have the time to get in these large guilds. Now I realize that the way retail fixed this was to have multiple difficulties that kind of stem off of each tier. You have four difficulties that stem off of each raid tier that reward, increasing or decreasing levels of gear depending on the level. And this is kind of how it evens the playing field. But in my opinion, and people who don't run, if you guys play retail, if you don't run Mythic raiding, do you feel like you've actually completed the raid? Now I realize it's a feat to get raids done, even if it's a non-Mythic raid. But knowing that there's always a level ahead that you maybe can't attain based upon skill, time and commitment, and social standings within your guild, right? So a guild has to be pretty well built and sustainable to go into Mythic raiding. Does that make you feel good? And in my opinion, going back into what I've done, Defcamp was a Mythic raider in retail. I've done heroics and dabbled in Mythic. Did you feel justified, or did you feel like you actually completed that tier? And this is something that Classic does very well, because there is no additional difficulty in these raids, right? So you just have the one raid tier, and that's it. Same gear, same itemization, same everything. Now, how do you breed competition in a system like this? Well, there's a couple ways. You can do world first, you can do speed runs, you could do non-optimal raid builds, which either you reduce the number of players or you do loadouts that wouldn't be considered optimal, like an all shaman raid or an all druid raid, things like that, right? Now, I wouldn't say that non-optimal raiding is really competitive, but it's more of a bragging right, I think. Now, world first and speedruns are absolutely competitive, and they do have bragging rights that come with them as well. Knowing that you're the first person to clear a raid tier is huge. Having the fastest run of a raid tier, again, when that raid is relevant, is also really huge too. Even when Naxx comes out and people are in tier 3 equivalent, you can still go back to these raids and do them again and procure these fast speedruns. Moreover, the way Classic is built, each raid tier is relevant even when Naxx comes out. Let's say that someone still needs Thunder Fury and they still want to get it. I mean, at that point you probably don't need it, but what I'm saying is that we're still running MC every week because there are pieces of gear that are needed or could potentially be an upgrade. And there's even dungeons, right? Look at Savage Gladiator chain, right? So people are going to be running Blackrock Depths, which kind of is right below here, guys. It's kind of right down here. People are still running different things to get optimal pieces. And that's, I think, is a beautiful game design. Regardless if it's a 15-year-old game and the content's easy, going forward, looking at how MMOs can be built in the future, this is very interesting. So I'm going to go through what I think would be an even more optimal way of doing this. So we're going to have the same axes, right? And I'm not going to put the actual numbers here, guys, but as you know, what the arrow means, that player number, character number, and then over here is, let's just put level and eye level, okay? So I think the Classic does things pretty well. You have dungeons that are 5-man content that kind of increase in difficulty as you go up, right? You have blah blah blah, new dungeons each level, each like 2 to 3 levels that go up. And then you have a collection of dungeons that are kind of pre-raid dungeons. And this is where you get your pre-raid bits. So we'll just say pre-raid. And then, of course, you introduce your first raid tier. So we'll do tier 1. Now, what I think would be a better way of accessing more people is to introduce content that requires less people, but is of the same difficulty as the raid, and provides gear that is equivalent to the raid, or is complementary to that raid. So you would have, when tier 1 raid comes out, you unlock another dungeon. We can call it dungeon tier 1. And there could be multiple of these. It doesn't have to be one. It could be two dungeons that come out. It could be 10-man. You know, it doesn't have to be 5-man. It could be a little bit bigger, like a mini raid almost, right? So there's no reason to say that this can't be a larger amount of people can get involved in this. And as far as the narrative of the game is concerned, in retail, it's much more apparent that each raid tier builds a narrative and the lore keeps extending in that way. Well, the lore can extend in multiple ways, and a good story has multiple ways that the plot is driven. So we can continue in a different way, building the storyline using dungeons or using lower content that's not full, let's say 25-man, because 25-man is probably today a standard that I would go with. I know that in retail there's flex, and Mythic is, I believe, 30 people, but there's somewhere in that happy medium of 20 to 30 people would be a full raid tier. So you can just continue this out, and you do tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. You know, you have these raids coming out, but it's important to see at the same time you have dungeon tiers that are also coming out. And this is successive with the raid itself. It comes out with the raid. The plot could be tied to the raid, but it provides players a way to involve themselves in endgame content and get really good gear, but not having to be in a guild per se, or have a lot of time to get in these 40-man raids. And I think that 40-man raiding, as we're seeing now, is a mechanic in itself. There are many people who perhaps don't pull their weight or don't really care, because you can kind of sit in the back in a 40-man raid and not do your job in some fights. That's going to change as raids progress in Classic WoW, but it's a reality for a lot of guilds, I think. In this way, you have a lot of cross-pollination as well. I think you can easily jump from here to here, go back and forth, and maybe you're going to have to go into one of these dungeons to grab an item for a mechanic in a raid. This, to me, is the way that, and I'm sure some MMOs do this already. I'm at the disadvantage that I only play WoW, okay? So I'm sure that there's systems that are like this, but going forward into how to build an MMO, I think this is the best way to do it. And, you know, just to close, I want to know how you guys feel about this. Do you think one raid tier is the best way to go? Do you like the fact that retail has multiple difficulties within a tier? I think for building camaraderie and for the realization of the lore and understanding the reality of the game you're building or the world you're building, a single raid tier just makes all those things pop and more effective. And as far as competitive nature, you can build competition in player-driven ways. It's player-generated content that makes MMOs survive. It's player-generated content that keeps things interesting, in my opinion. And speedruns and world firsts, suboptimal raid building, that's player-driven content, right? And I think that you can build a beautiful MMO, and Classic WoW knew this and did this, I think, because they wanted everyone to feel like they're killing the same boss. They're driving the plot together instead of one group's driving the plot, really. I mean, you get to see the cinematics if you do LFR in retail, but did you really clear the raid? In my opinion, you did not. You can AFK through pretty much all of LFR. And when we think about Classic WoW, we can actually compare. We can use those terms from retail and compare difficulty. MC was the first raid that was ever built. In my opinion, MC is LFR, if we can kind of compare back and forth. BWL is normal, AQ will be heroic, and Next will be mythic. So you even have that structure building your MMO up and providing different difficulties as the tiers progress. So guys, it's just one of those things where I know sometimes I make videos because I just have a thought in my head and I want to get it out into the world. I'm really interested in what you guys think about this. How does one raid difficulty make you feel in Classic WoW? Does it make you feel included, or does it make the content trivialized? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway, I hope you all have a really great day. Keep on keybinding and grinding, and stay tuned for the next Defcamp Melderon T video, and follow us on Twitch. We've been doing the Iron Man challenge. It's a lot of fun. Twitch.tv/Melderon and Twitch.tv/Defcamp. Defcamp also streams on YouTube. Hardcore mode, another piece of player-driven content that Cargo's created that is just reinvigorating a lot of people's play. So I think about that, and I think about, MMOs in general. How can MMOs put power in the players' hands? And I think that having one raid competition and letting us decide what competition should look like is a way to do that. Have a good one, guys.